Imagine trying to construct a massive 80-story skyscraper.
Right, like a huge capital project.
Yeah, exactly. You have the blueprints, you have a workforce ready to go, and you have all the raw materials.
Mhm.
But there is this fundamental flaw in your environment. You are building directly on top of an active fault line.
Oh, which is just a nightmare for any engineer.
Total nightmare. And not just any fault line. The tectonic plates beneath your construction site shift violently
Hmm.
and like completely unpredictably every single year.
Wow.
So one year, the ground suddenly drops 10 feet. You scramble to reinforce the foundation, pouring everything you have just to keep the structure from collapsing.
Just doing pure damage control.
Right. Then, the very next year, the ground violently thrusts upward by 50 feet.
Unbelievable.
Your scaffolding shatters, your workers are thrown off balance, and your carefully laid plans are just completely obsolete. You might think, well, an upward thrust is positive, right? Like, after all, you are higher up than you were yesterday.
On paper, it looks like a game.
Exactly. But how on earth do you actually lay down the plumbing? How do you install an elevator shaft? How do you plan for the next decade of construction when the very ground beneath your feet is completely untrustworthy?
I mean, you don't. You really just don't. That kind of profound structural volatility forces anyone, whether it's a construction manager or, say, a national government, into a permanent state of short-term triage.
Triage is the perfect word for it.
Yeah, you completely abandon the concept of the next decade. You just start agonizing over how to simply survive the next month. Long-term capital accumulation becomes mathematically and, honestly, psychologically impossible.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because that tectonic instability is exactly what we're exploring today. We're taking a deep dive into an absolutely massive, multi-decade data set of world development indicators.
It's a really incredible set of data.
It is. And we are focusing our lens on a specific West African nation, Guinea-Bissau. But, we aren't just going to rattle off a spreadsheet of percentages and decimal points for you today.
No, that would be incredibly dry.
Right. Our mission today is to build a rigorous logical chain from these abstract macroeconomic forces down to the daily lived realities of human beings. We want to understand how a nation operates when it's caught between extreme vulnerability and this desperate push for resilience.
And it is a phenomenal data set, I have to say. It paints a picture of a country trapped in a highly complex web of structural paradoxes.
Yeah, paradox is definitely the theme here.
We are going to examine an economy where growth can swing wildly by hundreds of percent in a single calendar year. We'll explore the demographic pressure of a massive youth population that is completely disconnected from the classroom.
Which is just staggering to look at.
Right. And crucially, we really have to dissect the deep tension between the influx of foreign aid and the severe fragility of domestic state governance. I mean, it is a story about what happens when the mechanisms of state building just stall out completely.
Yeah, so if you are listening and mapping this out in your head, trying to find the baseline of this economy, the first thing that jumps out of the data is that the very concept of a baseline doesn't actually seem to exist.
Right. In classical development economics, when we evaluate a nation's macroeconomic health, we are always searching for a trend line.
Like a steady, predictable curve.
Exactly. We want to see a smooth, consistent upward trajectory. Even if that upward slope is very shallow, say like 2 or 3% growth a year, that predictability signals reliable governance.
Because it means you can plan.
Yes. It means steady capital accumulation and markets that citizens and investors can actually trust. But when you track Guinea-Bissau's macroeconomic data over the years, that theoretical trend line completely disintegrates.
Disintegrates is the right word. I mean, in the historical data, we see years where the national income absolutely craters. We were talking about annual GDP contractions of like 13.1% or 16.9%.
Those are massive shocks.
There's one year in the data where the national income plummeted by 36.6%. Think about the gravity of that for a second. More than a third of the entire nation's wealth generation simply wiped off the map in a 12-month window.
And the whiplash is just as severe in the opposite direction. Because, volatility isn't just about crashes, it's about the unpredictable surges, too.
Right, the 50-foot upward thrusts from the analogy.
Precisely. The data set records subsequent rebound years that just defy standard economic modeling. We see a jump of 16.32%, later a surge of 62.6%, and there is an absolutely staggering single-year expansion recorded at 201.3%.
Okay, I have to stop you there and push back on this a bit.
Yeah.
Because I think anyone listening to that number would immediately think, wait a minute, A 200% increase?
Huh.
That sounds like a lottery win.
It does sound like one, yeah.
Right. If an economy triples in a single year, shouldn't that massive windfall generate a huge surplus? Like, why wouldn't the government just take that windfall, save the excess, and use it to buffer the bad years? Why is a steady 3% growth somehow better than a year of 200% growth?
It's a highly logical question, but
Hmm.
well, it hits on a fundamental misunderstanding of what state capacity actually is.
Okay, break that down for us.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, a sudden 200% surge in national income in a developing economy is rarely the result of suddenly inventing a highly efficient new industry.
They didn't just invent a new iPhone overnight.
Exactly. It is almost always a shock driven by external factors. So, like a sudden spike in global commodity prices for a primary export or a massive one off influx of foreign capital. The problem is that the state apparatus lacks the institutional plumbing to absorb that much capital efficiently.
Institutional plumbing, what do you mean by that?
I mean, the actual physical and bureaucratic mechanisms required to spend money wisely. If a government suddenly has 3 times its normal budget, sure, it wants to build roads, hospitals, and power grids.
Yeah, of course.
But you cannot simply buy a completed highway off a shelf. You need civil engineers to draft plans, you need environmental impact studies, you need a transparent procurement system to hire contractors, and crucially, you need a robust legal system to enforce those contracts.
Which takes years to build.
Decades sometimes. And a highly vulnerable state simply does not have those systems waiting on standby.
So what happens? Does the money just sit there? Or worse, does it get misallocated?
Exactly. Without that plumbing, a massive influx of cash often leads to hyperinflation within the local economy. Or it gets captured by political elites, which leads to severe corruption.
Ah, right.
The Gini coefficient data, which measures wealth inequality, highlights this perfectly. If we look at the data set, the Gini index fluctuates wildly, sometimes sitting around 35.6, but occasionally spiking up to 43.6 or even a staggering 55.6.
Wow. And just for context, a Gini index of over 50 indicates extreme systemic inequality, right?
Extreme. So when that 200% boom happens, the wealth doesn't flow down to the rural farmer. It gets bottlenecked at the very top. Extreme wealth distribution issues just freeze social mobility.
And then, inevitably, the boom ends.
Yes. The commodity price drops, the external shock fades, and the economy contracts again by 16 or 30%. And this is where the volatility truly destroys the state.
Because they started projects they can't finish.
Exactly. Let's say during the boom year, the government actually did start building a power plant. They hired workers, they poured concrete, but the next year the budget just evaporates, the construction stops, the workers are laid off, the half-built machinery sits in the tropical rain and rusts.
That is so deeply frustrating to even picture.
It is. The contractors leave the country. When the next boom cycle comes around, maybe 5 years later, you can't just flip a switch and resume construction. You have to start all over again. Extreme volatility fundamentally destroys institutional memory and prevents infrastructure from ever crossing the finish line.
Which makes perfect sense when you look at the per capita income data. Because despite these wild percentage swings, the 60% jumps, the 30% drops, the actual adjusted net national income per person tells a very grim, flatlining story.
The baseline is incredibly fragile.
It really is. For decades, it has hovered in the low hundreds of dollars. We see it dipping down to around $74 per person for the entire year, and at its absolute best, struggling to climb to $678. So the percentages are screaming, but the actual wealth on the ground is barely a whisper.
That flat line in per capita income is the ultimate proof that the volatility is consuming all the potential energy of the economy. The nation is running on a treadmill that occasionally speeds up to a sprint and occasionally throws them off entirely, but they are never actually moving forward.
So we have to ask the causal question here. What is the engine generating this volatility? Because, an economy doesn't just swing by 200% because of bad luck. There has to be a structural root to this instability.
The root of the volatility lies almost entirely in the structure of the labor market and the severe lack of economic diversification.
Okay.
To understand why the national income behaves like a seismograph, you simply have to look at what the vast majority of the citizens do every single day when they wake up. They are tied to the soil.
And the employment data paints an incredibly stark picture of that reality. When we examine the agricultural value added as a percentage of the entire gross domestic product, It is a massive anchor on the economy.
It is.
It frequently bounces between 40% and 56% of the nation's total economic output.
But we really have to translate that GDP percentage into human capital. How many people does it actually take to generate that agricultural output?
A lot, I'm assuming.
A tremendous amount. The modeled estimates for employment in agriculture reveal a profound structural trap. For the male workforce, agricultural employment consistently hovers around 65 to 74%.
Wow. And for women, the tie to the soil is even deeper. The data shows female employment in agriculture consistently sitting around 71%.
Yes.
7 out of every 10 working women in the country are engaged in agricultural labor.
And this is the actual mechanism behind the macroeconomic volatility we just discussed. Think about it. When roughly 70% of your human capital and half of your GDP is dedicated to agriculture, your sovereign economy is no longer controlled by a central bank or a finance ministry.
Right. They have no levers to pull.
None. Your economy is entirely controlled by meteorology and global commodities markets.
Because if there's a drought, or if the monsoon rains arrive a month late, the primary income source for 7 out of 10 families just vanishes.
Precisely. Guinea-Bissau is heavily reliant on the export of raw cashew nuts. So they are not only exposed to local weather patterns, they are totally exposed to the whims of international commodities brokers in exchanges thousands of miles away.
So they have no control over the price of their own labor.
None at all. If the global supply of cashews goes up because of a bumper crop in, say, India or Vietnam, the global price drops and suddenly Guinea-Bissau's national income plummets by 15%. They have zero pricing power. They are price takers, not price makers.
But wait, when you look at the historical trajectory of almost any developed nation, they all started as agrarian economies. I mean, the classic path to development is that a country starts with 70% of its people on farms, and then they slowly move to cities, they build factories, they start manufacturing textiles, then electronics, and eventually they become a service economy.
The standard structural transformation model, yes.
Right. That is how you build a middle class. So why isn't that structural transformation happening here?
Because the data indicates that Guinea-Bissau is experiencing something highly unusual and deeply concerning, they are facing structural regression.
Regression, like going backward.
Exactly. They aren't just stalling on the path to industrialization. In many ways, they have moved backward.
Yeah, the deindustrialization numbers are fascinating and honestly a bit tragic.
Yeah.
Let's trace the manufacturing value added as a percentage of GDP.
Let's do that.
In the historical data, there was a point where manufacturing reached a peak of around 21.2%. That means a fifth of the economy was actually making things, refining materials, adding value to raw goods.
A solid foundation for an emerging middle class.
Right. But as we move the timeline forward toward the present, that sector just collapses. We see the industrial contribution, including construction, just hovering weakly, and pure manufacturing drops from 21.2% down to an abysmal 2.4%, occasionally creeping up to 3.6%.
That collapse is the erasure of the middle class before it even had a chance to solidify. Moving from 21% to roughly 3% in manufacturing means the nation has lost its capacity to process its own natural resources. Instead of taking those raw cashew nuts, roasting them, packaging them, branding them, and selling them at a premium.
Which creates factory jobs, marketing jobs, logistics jobs.
Exactly. Instead of all that, they are forced to export the raw, uncracked nut at the absolute lowest possible price.
And then, presumably, they have to turn around and import finished packaged goods from other countries at a massive premium.
Exactly. They export cheap raw materials and import expensive manufactured goods. This traps the country in a permanent trade deficit. They are constantly bleeding capital outward, which leaves no domestic capital to invest back into local businesses.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. I want to share a specific data point here that stopped me in my tracks when I was reviewing the World Bank indicators. I actually thought I was misreading the spreadsheet, or like missing a comma somewhere.
I think I know which metric you're about to bring up.
It's wild. There is an indicator that tracks the total value of high-technology exports. Now, in a developed economy, this number is in the tens or hundreds of billions.
Right.
In an emerging market, it might be in the millions. Do you know what the absolute recorded dollar amount was for Guinea-Bissau's high-tech exports in a recent year?
I do, and it is a chilling representation of being entirely locked out of the modern global value chain.
It was $18. 18.00. $18 for the entire nation.
It's almost hard to comprehend.
I don't even understand what that physical transaction looks
Yeah.
like. Did someone mail 2 digital watches and a spare calculator across the border? Like, how can a sovereign nation of millions of people have a high-tech export value of $18?
Well, statistically, it's an anomaly that essentially functions as a zero. But it forces us to confront the brutal reality of the global economy.
Well,
If a country has no reliable electricity grid, no advanced logistics networks, and a workforce trapped in subsistence farming, it is completely impossible to attract foreign direct investment for advanced manufacturing. Global capital is ruthless. It only goes where the infrastructure is ready.
and that brings up a massive logical puzzle for me. If 70% of the labor force is engaged in volatile agriculture, and the manufacturing base has collapsed from 21% to 3%, and they are exporting exactly zero high-value goods, how does the state actually survive?
That is the million-dollar question, or in this case, the billion-dollar question.
Right. How does the government pay its civil servants, maintain the army, or keep the lights on in the capital city?
They cannot do it internally. The domestic tax base is just far too shallow to support the apparatus of a sovereign state.
So what do?
This leads us to the mechanism of survival: external financing. When a state cannot generate wealth from its own soil or its own factories, it is forced to borrow, and it is forced to rely on the charity of the international community.
Okay, let's unpack the debt side of that survival strategy first, because the acceleration is alarming. If we look at the indicator for external debt stocks, early records in this data set showed the total external debt sitting at a relatively manageable, $8 million or so.
It's a very modest starting point.
But over the decades, as the manufacturing sector collapsed and the volatility continued, that debt load just exploded. It climbs to 50 million, surges past 137 million, crests 500 million, and the most recent figures we have push the total external debt to over $1.43 billion.
And absolute numbers like 1.43 billion can be hard to contextualize for an economy of this size. The metric we really need to focus on is the present value of external debt as a percentage of the gross national income, or GNI.
Right.
We see that figure hitting staggering heights. It's climbed to 115.5%, and there was a peak where it hit an extreme risk level of 251.2% of GNI. Even recently, it hovers around a crippling 47.89%.
Wait, let me make sure I understand this clearly, acting as a proxy for anyone listening. Why do economists look at the present value of the debt rather than just taking the 1.43 billion and comparing it directly to the GDP? What does present value actually mean in this context?
It's a crucial distinction, actually. Present value is a financial calculation that looks at all the future debt payments, both the principal and the interest that the country is contracted to pay over the next several decades.
Okay.
And it discounts those future payments back into today's dollars. It essentially answers the question: if you had to write one single check today to clear all future debt obligations, how big would that check be?
I see. And for Guinea-Bissau, that single check would consume almost half, or at its peak, 2.5 times the entire income generated by the nation in a year.
Precisely. A present value of almost 48% of GNI is a suffocating burden. It means that an enormous portion of whatever wealth the country does manage to generate is instantly earmarked for foreign creditors.
So it never reaches the domestic economy.
Right. This creates a severe fiscal bottleneck. The government cannot invest in education or healthcare because its primary fiscal duty is servicing historical debt.
And what kind of debt is this? Because earlier you mentioned that they lack the infrastructure to attract standard foreign direct investment. Are global investment banks really lending billions of dollars to a state with extreme macroeconomic volatility?
Not at standard commercial rates, no. Much of this debt is comprised of concessional loans. These are loans provided by multilateral institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, or bilateral government partners.
Concessional meaning?
Subsidized.
Yes, they are called concessional because they are offered at below-market interest rates, often with very long grace periods before repayment even begins.
Okay, so it's heavily subsidized lending.
Yes, but here is the danger. Even with a 1% interest rate and a 10-year grace period, if the principal is $1.43 billion and your economy is trapped in a low-growth agrarian cycle, that concessional loan still eventually comes due.
The bill always comes due. And when it does, it drains the very limited tax revenue the state has managed to collect.
Which brings us to the second and arguably more complex pillar of their external financing: official development assistance, or ODA, basically foreign aid.
Yes.
When we look at the data on net ODA received as a percentage of central government expense, the figures are absolutely jaw-dropping. We see years where foreign aid covers 58.5% of the government's entire expenses, and there is a peak where it hits 77.1%.
I want to let that number breathe for a moment. 77.1%.
It's huge.
More than three-quarters of everything the central government spent in that year was paid for by foreign donors, international NGOs, and multilateral agencies.
If you are listening to this and you apply that to your own country, it forces a profound rethinking of what a government actually is. If international donors in Paris, Washington, or Geneva are paying for nearly 80% of a state's expenses, who is the government truly accountable to? The citizens who vote or the donors who hold the purse strings?
This raises an important question, and it is the core of what political economists refer to as the paradox of aid. Now, we must be incredibly careful here.
Absolutely.
Official development assistance is a vital, life-saving lifeline. It funds immunization campaigns, it provides emergency food relief during droughts. It literally keeps millions of human beings alive in fragile contexts. We're in no way suggesting that this aid is unnecessary or malicious.
Right. No one is looking at this data and concluding that the international community should just turn off the tap and let people suffer.
Absolutely not. But if we want to understand the structural realities of state building, we have to examine how massive, sustained, multi-decade aid alters the social contract between a government and its people.
How so?
Historically, how does a robust state develop? It develops through taxation. To build a road or field an army, a king or a parliament has to extract taxes from the population.
And citizens generally despise paying taxes unless they get something in return.
Exactly. It creates a forced negotiation. The citizens say, we will pay a portion of our income, but in exchange you must provide physical security, you must enforce property rights, and you must build courts to resolve our disputes.
It's a transaction.
Yes, the state is forced to become competent to justify its extraction of wealth. This friction is how accountability is born.
Like the old saying, no taxation without representation.
Precisely. But what happens when a government doesn't need to tax its citizens to survive? If 77% of your operating budget is wired into the central bank from overseas, the state apparatus no longer needs to engage with its domestic population.
Wow.
It doesn't need to build a tax collection agency, it doesn't need to map property boundaries, and it doesn't need to foster domestic industries to expand the tax base.
The government essentially turns its back on the domestic economy and faces outward.
Yes. The civil service becomes highly skilled at writing grant proposals to international agencies, hosting foreign delegations, and complying with donor reporting requirements. They become a highly efficient machine for managing external aid, but they remain critically underdeveloped when it comes to delivering basic, horizontal services to their own people.
And the data on governance indicators backs this up spectacularly. The World Bank also tracks what they call the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI.
Which is a very sobering data set.
It really is. When you look at the metric for rule of law, which measures the confidence citizens have in the police, the courts, and property rights, Guinea-Bissau's percentile rank globally is often in the single digits. We are looking at rankings of 1.4%, maybe climbing to 9.5% in a good year.
That's incredibly low.
It means 90 to 98% of all other countries on Earth have a stronger rule of law.
Which is the direct result of a bypass social contract. When the state relies on foreign aid instead of domestic taxation, the courts and police forces are perpetually underfunded and underdeveloped. There's just a vacuum of institutional trust.
Yeah, and the indicator for political stability and absence of violence tells the exact same story. It consistently ranks below the 20th percentile, frequently dipping into the 12 to 16% range. And the control of corruption metric is deeply negative, barely breaking the 30th percentile at its best.
Right.
It is a portrait of a state that is financially afloat, thanks to international goodwill, but structurally hollowed out from the inside.
And that hollowness leads to extreme desperation. Because even with 77% of the budget covered by aid and billions in external debt, the local population still has to survive day to day.
They still have to eat.
Exactly. When the manufacturing sector is dead and agriculture is volatile and the state cannot provide a safety net, how do the actual citizens generate cash? They turn to the only asset they have left.
They liquidate the environment.
Yes.
Which brings us to one of the most brilliant and honestly terrifying economic metrics in the entire data set. adjusted net savings.
It is a phenomenal metric. It was developed to correct the massive blind spots of traditional economic accounting.
Because if we only look at gross domestic product, we are looking at a highly flawed measurement of success,
It's
right?
completely flawed, yes.
GDP just measures the total value of goods and services produced. Doesn't care how you produce them. I always think of it like home ownership.
Okay, let's hear the analogy.
If I lose my job, max out my credit cards, and then decide to take a sledgehammer to my walls, rip out all the copper plumbing, and sell it to a scrapyard, my personal GDP for that month looks amazing.
You'd have a lot of cash on hand.
Exactly. I have thousands of dollars in cash flow. My accountant would say I had a record quarter. But the reality is I have destroyed the intrinsic value of my primary asset. I am tangibly, fundamentally poorer.
That is the perfect analogy for how many resource-dependent economies operate. Traditional metrics count the extraction and sale of natural resources, whether it's oil, minerals, or timber, as pure positive income.
Even though the resource is gone forever.
Exactly. They completely ignore the fact that the nation is drawing down its finite natural capital. Adjusted net savings attempts to fix this accounting error. It starts with the gross national savings. It adds investments made in education because educating a child builds future human capital, and then it heavily subtracts the depletion of natural resources, like chopping down forests, as well as the economic damage caused by pollution.
So it calculates whether a country is actually building wealth or just cannibalizing itself.
Exactly.
And when we apply the adjusted net savings metric to Guinea-Bissau, the numbers are flashing red. Let's look at the indicator for adjusted net savings, including particulate emission damage as a percentage of GNI. The data reveals deeply, consistently negative numbers.
Consistently in the red.
We see years where it is negative 10%, dropping to negative 15%, and at its worst, plunging to an astonishing negative 27.6%.
A negative adjusted net savings of that magnitude is catastrophic for long-term survival. A negative 27% means that the nation is becoming poorer by more than a quarter of its entire economic output every single year.
It's bleeding out.
Yes, the value of the environment they are destroying drastically outweighs any wealth they are generating or any investments they are making in education.
And what exactly are they liquidating? What is the copper plumbing in this scenario? The dataset points a giant arrow directly at the forests. The indicator for adjusted savings, net forest depletion, as a percentage of GNI reaches staggering, unbelievable highs. 26.2%, 28%, and a historical peak of 34.2%.
Let's translate that percentage into physical reality. Over a third of the country's equivalent national income was generated simply by chopping down its own trees without replacing them.
That's just wild.
This isn't sustainable forestry. This is a fire sale of the nation's ecology.
And the tragic irony here is how deeply interconnected this all is. Because they aren't just losing trees, they are destroying the foundation of their own economy.
Precisely. We have to link this directly back to our discussion earlier about the labor market. What do 70% of the people do for a living?
They farm.
They farm. What happens when you clear-cut over 30% of your forests? You destroy the root systems that hold the topsoil together. You alter the local microclimates and rainfall patterns.
Right, without the trees, the monsoon rains just wash all that fertile topsoil into the rivers.
Exactly. So by liquidating the forests to survive today, they are virtually guaranteeing that their agricultural yields will drop tomorrow.
Which means the 70% of the workforce relying on farming will become even poorer.
Yes, making them more vulnerable to macroeconomic volatility and forcing them to chop down even more trees just to survive the next season. It is a perfect closed loop of environmental and economic degradation.
It is a wealth drain that mortgages the future to pay for the present. And this liquidation of natural capital naturally forces us to examine the other side of the ledger, the human capital.
Right, the people.
Because while the country is rapidly depleting its physical resources, it is simultaneously experiencing a massive demographic explosion.
Yes. The demographic profile is arguably the most critical variable in determining the nation's future. We are looking at a classic youth bulge.
Let's look at the data on this demographic pressure cooker. The primary metric here is the age dependency ratio, young. For anyone unfamiliar, this measures the number of dependents, specifically children under the age of 15, as a percentage of the working-age adult population.
It measures the burden of care. A high ratio means a very small number of working adults has to feed, clothe, and educate a very large number of children.
And the historical peak in Guinea-Bissau for this indicator is an astounding 93.9%. Think about what that means. That is nearly one dependent child under 15 for every single working-age adult in the entire country.
It's an enormous burden on the working generation.
Now, the data does show this slowly transitioning downward, hitting around 66.8% in recent years, but that is still a tremendously heavy demographic anchor. Furthermore, when you look at the raw population breakdown, children aged 0 to 14 make up roughly 41 to 45% of the total population. Almost half the country is composed of children.
In macroeconomic theory, a youth bulge of this size is often discussed as a potential demographic dividend.
A dividend, like a bonus.
Yeah, the theory goes that if you have a massive generation of young people aging into the workforce, and if they are healthy, and if they're well educated, and if their industry's ready to hire them, they will turbocharge your economic growth.
Right.
This is exactly the demographic engine that drove the Asian tiger economies in the late 20th century.
But listen closely to the enormous ifs in that theory. If they are educated, if there are jobs. So what does this all mean? We have to ask the data. Is Guinea-Bissau preparing this massive youth cohort to deliver a demographic dividend? Are they being equipped to build a modern economy?
Well, the education data provides a brutal answer to that.
It does. Let's examine the data on primary school children out of school. We're seeing absolute numbers of out-of-school boys hitting 34,000 to over 42,000 at peaks. And proportionately, the figures sit consistently around 55% to 61%. More than half of all children of primary school age are simply not sitting in a classroom.
And as tragic as that is, the data grows exponentially worse as those children age into adolescence.
It becomes catastrophic. The indicator for adolescents out of school, which measures the lower secondary school age bracket, reaches an astronomical 89%. 89%.
This phenomenon is what development economists classify as learning poverty. When nearly 90% of your teenage population is entirely disconnected from formal education, the dream of a demographic dividend instantly vanishes.
It's gone.
Instead of an economic engine, that massive youth cohort becomes a heavy, destabilizing anchor.
I really want to force us to visualize what an 89% adolescent out-of-school rate actually looks like in a society. Think about a local high school in your own community. Picture the hallways, the classrooms, the sports fields. Now, physically remove 9 out of every 10 students from that building.
It's a ghost town.
It's a complete ghost town.
Yeah.
And it begs an immediate glaring question. If 90% of the teenagers aren't in classrooms learning math, reading, and civic engagement, where are they? What are they physically doing all day?
The data set answers that question, but we have to cross-reference multiple indicators to see it.
Right. We pivot to the indicator for children in employment, work only. Historically, this figure has been as high as 63.7%. And then we remember the foundational data point from Section 2. 70% of the workforce is trapped in agriculture.
So those teenagers are not in school learning the advanced skills required to build a manufacturing sector or a digital service economy. They are in the fields.
Working the land.
Yes. They are engaged in hard, manual subsistence farming. They are subject to the extreme economic volatility of the cashew markets. Their human capital potential is being entirely consumed by the daily requirement to just secure basic calories.
They are trapped in the exact same structural cycle as their parents. And within this human capital crisis, the data reveals a severe secondary fracture, a profound gender disparity.
The gender gap in education is arguably the single most damaging metric when it comes to long-term systemic development.
The numbers are stark. If we look at the historical data for the adjusted net enrollment rate in primary school, we see early female enrollment sitting at a dismal 29.7%. Meanwhile, male enrollment was double that at around 59.5%.
A massive gap.
Now, the recent data does show improvement. The gap at the primary level has narrowed, with female enrollment climbing to 70.8% and male to 74.5%.
And that closure at the primary level is a genuine victory. We should acknowledge that.
Absolutely.
However, the legacy of that historical gap, combined with the 89% dropout rate at the secondary level, means that the adult female workforce remains deeply marginalized. Other data points confirm this. Historical literacy rates for young men aged 15 to 24 hovered around 60%, while young women were mired down near 17%.
That is a staggering divide.
It is. The female transition to lower secondary school and their graduation rates remain vanishingly small.
Why does development economics place such a heavy emphasis on female education specifically? Why is that gender gap so toxic to a nation's resilience?
Because educating women creates the most powerful cascading effects in all of economics.
How so?
Well, when you educate a girl through secondary school, her statistical age of marriage goes up and her total fertility rate goes down, which naturally eases the demographic pressure we just discussed.
Ah, right. It lowers that youth dependency ratio.
Exactly. Furthermore, an educated mother is exponentially more likely to ensure her own children are vaccinated, well-nourished, and sent to school. Leaving women out of the classroom essentially cuts the societal return on investment in half and locks the next generation into the exact same cycle of learning poverty.
Speaking of public health,
Yeah.
actually, let's not just transition casually here, because the health data in this data set is deeply intertwined with that lack of infrastructure and human capital we've been discussing. Yet, when you look at the medical indicators, you suddenly encounter these bizarre, miraculous spikes of success.
It really is jarring.
It feels like you are reading data from two completely different planets.
It is one of the most fascinating dichotomies in global development. We are looking at the stark, jarring contrast between highly successful, donor-funded global health interventions and the absolute failure of basic domestic infrastructure.
Let's start with the medical miracles, because they are definitely worth celebrating. Look at the maternal mortality ratio. Modeled estimates show a massive, life-saving intervention over the timeline. In the early data, we see an absolutely tragic 1,851 deaths per 100,000 live births.
It's a staggering rate of mortality.
It is. But over the years, that number plunges down to 505. That is a steep, beautiful downward curve. That's thousands upon thousands of mothers surviving childbirth. At the same time, female life expectancy has slowly climbed from about 39 years up to 46 years.
Still low globally, but a clear marginal improvement in survival.
Right. And the data for the management of HIV and AIDS is even more spectacular. If we look at the indicator for antiretroviral therapy, or ART coverage, we watch the percentage of people living with HIV who are receiving advanced life-saving medication scale up from literally 0% to an incredible 79%.
Nearly 8 out of 10 patients receiving complex daily chemical interventions.
Alongside this, the data tracks the absolute number of new HIV infections falling steadily year over year. It is a triumph of modern medicine and global logistics.
This really is.
But, and this is the defining paradox of this entire deep dive, look at what happens when we pivot from complex medical treatments to basic, everyday domestic infrastructure.
This is where the data gets grim again.
Let's look at the indicator for access to clean fuels and technologies for cooking, rural. This metric measures how many people outside the main cities have access to something as simple as a propane stove or an electric hot plate, rather than burning raw wood or charcoal inside their homes.
The recorded number is 0.
It is an absolute jaw-dropping 0.0%. Even if you include the urban centers and look at the national average, it barely hovers over 1%.
Amazing.
And what about basic electricity? The indicator for access to electricity shows growth, moving from 1.3% up to 40.5% recently.
But as with all averages, that hides the reality. That electrical access is heavily skewed toward the urban elites in the capital. The rural access to a power grid remains effectively non-existent.
Right.
Furthermore, the sanitation data is equally grim. Data on open defecation in rural areas has historically hovered over 54%.
Over half the rural population.
Yes, over half the rural population lacks access to a basic latrine.
Okay, I have to pause here because we need to reconcile these two realities. We are looking at a country that can somehow successfully identify, diagnose, and deliver complex, temperature-sensitive antiretroviral drugs to 79% of its HIV patients. But 99% of the entire country still cooks their dinner over an open, dirty, smoke-filled fire, and half the rural population practices open defecation.
It seems impossible.
How is that logistically or politically possible?
What's fascinating here is that this bizarre dichotomy maps perfectly onto our earlier discussion about the paradox of aid. Why can this country deliver advanced RT medication but not clean cooking fuel? Because the health miracles, the scale-up of HIV medication, the malaria bed nets, the maternal health clinics are almost entirely driven by highly targeted vertical programs. And they are funded by the official development assistance we discussed.
Let's define vertical programs for the listener.
Yeah.
This means a global organization, say the Global Fund or a major Western NGO, comes into the country, looks at the broken domestic infrastructure, and says, we aren't going to rely on the local Ministry of Health.
Exactly. They bypass the state entirely.
They set up their own independent, parallel supply chain just for that one disease. They import the drugs directly, they hire their own specific staff, often paying them in US dollars, and they deliver the pills directly to the patients.
Exactly. It operates like a silo, completely parallel to the host state. And it is incredibly efficient for solving a specific, measurable medical problem. They achieve their metrics and they save lives.
Which is great for those specific patients.
Yes. But basic infrastructure, laying down a national electrical grid, building a sewage system, or distributing clean natural gas to rural villages, that requires horizontal development.
Horizontal development meaning it requires the entire society to level up together.
Precisely. You cannot build a power grid as a vertical silo. A power grid requires a highly functional, resilient, long-term domestic state apparatus.
Which Guinea-Bissau struggles with.
Right. It requires a government that can enforce property rights to lay cables, a tax collection system to pay for maintenance, a legal system to bill customers, and the political stability to plan 30 years into the future.
And as we saw earlier, the macroeconomic volatility of relying on agriculture makes long-term 30-year planning impossible, and the rule of law is below 10%.
Right. Global aid can parachute a box of life-saving medicine into a village. It cannot parachute a functional Ministry of Public Works, a transparent customs agency, or a national power grid into a village.
Yet has to come from within.
Exactly. The lack of electricity, the lack of clean cooking fuel, and the high rates of open defecation are symptoms of profound domestic institutional fragility.
And the lack of horizontal infrastructure creates physical bottlenecks that choke off all other development.
Yeah.
If we look at the data on logistics and customs efficiency, things like the Logistics Performance Index, the lead times to import or export goods are massive.
The friction is too high.
The ports are inefficient. The telecommunications infrastructure, like fixed-line phones, is practically non-existent. So even if a domestic entrepreneur wanted to start a manufacturing business, the physical friction of just getting a shipping container through customs, combined with the lack of reliable electricity, kills the business plan immediately.
Which forces the population right back into the informal agricultural economy. And we cannot ignore the daily human cost of these missing basics. Think about the lived reality of that 0.0% clean cooking fuel statistic.
It's not just an inconvenience.
No, it is not just a minor inconvenience to cook over a wood fire. It means severe indoor air pollution. Women and children are breathing in toxic smoke every single day, leading to chronic respiratory diseases. Furthermore, the lack of sanitation directly drives the data we see on child malnutrition.
Right, the stunting data.
Yes. The rates of stunting, meaning children who are too short for their age due to chronic malnutrition and repeated infections from dirty water and wasting, are severely elevated among both boys and girls under 5.
And think about the physical labor required to sustain a 0% clean fuel economy. If you have no gas stove, you need wood. Who is tasked with spending 3 to 4 hours every single day walking miles into the brush to gather heavy bundles of firewood?
The youth, and disproportionately, the girls.
Exactly, which ties directly back to our data on the 89% of adolescents out of school.
It's all connected.
The data is a giant interconnected web. The lack of an electrical grid drives the demand for firewood, which drives the 34% rate of forest depletion we discussed, which drives soil erosion, which ruins the cashew harvest.
Yeah.
At the same time, the daily burden of gathering that firewood keeps the teenagers out of school, which drives the 89% learning poverty rate, which prevents the economy from ever industrializing away from volatile agriculture.
Which keeps the government reliant on foreign aid.
Which hollows out the domestic rule of law.
It is a closed loop of vulnerability. It is a perfect structural trap. And while the vertical foreign aid is absolutely essential for keeping people alive, it does not, and honestly cannot, break the loop.
Wow. We have traversed an absolutely massive landscape of data today. We started with the extreme macroeconomic volatility of an economy behaving like a tectonic fault line. We traced that to the structural trap of deindustrialization and the 70% of women tied to the soil.
A huge journey.
We unpacked the crippling burden of a $1.43 billion debt, peaking at 250% of GNI, and the governance paradox of a state funded 77% by foreign donors. We witnessed the literal liquidation of the country's forests to survive the present, the tragedy of an uneducated youth bulge, and the jarring reality of a nation that can cure HIV but cannot provide a gas stove or a toilet to its rural citizens.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. So, after looking at all this, how do we sum this up? How does a country like Guinea-Bissau plot a path out of this data-driven vulnerability and build actual durable resilience?
if we synthesize all the data points across this multi-decade data set, the path to resilience requires the construction of three fundamental strategic pillars.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first pillar is breaking the debt and aid loop through macroeconomic stabilization. Now, this absolutely does not mean rejecting international help. It means utilizing aid to build domestic value rather than just plugging holes in the budget.
Right.
The nation must escape the extreme volatility of the cashew cycle. They have to rebuild the manufacturing capacity they lost, moving from 3% back up to 20% to process their own raw goods. This generates internal tax revenue, which is the only way to reduce the reliance on ODA and stop the accumulation of unpayable concessional external debt.
Makes sense. What's the second pillar?
Investing aggressively in human capital. A nation cannot develop, let alone industrialize, if 89% of its adolescents aren't in a classroom. The state must transform that massive youth bulge from an economic anchor into a demographic dividend by eradicating learning poverty.
Getting them out of the fields and into schools.
Exactly. And crucially, based on everything we've seen, this requires permanently closing the gender gap. Ensuring that the female population is educated, healthy, and integrated into a modernizing workforce is the single highest leverage investment the state can make.
And the third pillar of resilience.
Rebuilding institutional trust and horizontal state capacity. The government must move beyond facilitating foreign-funded vertical band-aids. The state must develop the actual administrative competence to deliver basic, everyday services to its citizens, like an electrical grid, paved roads, and clean cooking fuels.
The horizontal infrastructure.
Yes. When a state can provide a reliable power grid and a functional court system, it proves its competence. That competence fosters domestic trust, encourages citizens to pay taxes, attracts real foreign direct investment rather than just charity, and finally solidifies the broken social contract.
It is about making the agonizing transition from merely surviving the day to actually having the institutional confidence to plan for the next decade.
Precisely. It is about building a foundation that doesn't shift under your feet.
You know, we started this deep dive talking about the impossible task of building a skyscraper on a fault line. The sheer anxiety of an unpredictable, volatile baseline. We've seen how that volatility scales up to paralyze an entire sovereign nation. But there's a deeper, almost philosophical question hiding inside all of these World Bank indicators.
What's that?
When a country's life-saving medicine is entirely funded, shipped, and administered by foreign donors, and its short-term economic survival relies on the literal liquidation of its own natural environment, where does the true sovereignty of its future reside?
That is the question.
How does a nation build a tomorrow when every single ounce of its human energy, every cent of its capital, is entirely consumed by the desperate act of just surviving today? It's something for all of you listening to really chew on.
It's a profound challenge.
Thank you for taking the time to truly dive into the mechanics of the world with us today. We'll see you in the next deep dive.